Hi and welcome to my YouTube channel. It's Cheryl Miller, Independent Stampin' Up! Demonstrator here in Australia. Thanks for joining me today. Welcome as a little surprise to my Sense of Whimsy VIP group. We are going to create a card today with the Forever Lovely stamp set, or more specifically the Lovely Flower dies. So let me flip you around and we'll go over to the craft table. Here is the card layer that I've already created. I haven't laid it up on the card front yet. We will do that in a minute. There is a lot of flowers here, but using the die from the Lovely Flowers dies that cuts 4 flowers out at once, and the small bloom punch means that it doesn't take very long to get enough flowers to do this job. So today I'm creating for the Colour Inspiration Challenge number 72, and the colours are Bermuda Bay, Grapefruit Grove, Calypso Coral and Pretty Peacock. For my background piece, I'm using shimmery white cardstock. I'll cut a piece at 13.7 centimetres by 9.4 centimetres, and all of the measurements in both metric and imperial are over on my blog. I do find that shimmery white cardstock is much better than regular white cardstock as it's coated and it holds the water really well. The background piece is going to be Bermuda Bay, so I'm using the Bermuda Bay re-inker. I'll put a couple of drops onto an acrylic block and I'm going to use an aqua painter for colouring. Now when you buy aqua painters from Stampin' Up, you get 2 brushes. So there's a medium tip and a large tip, and because I'm using 2 very different colours today, I'll use the medium tip for this background and the larger tip for the second piece, so as not to muddy up the colours. Now I'm just going to clean off this brush, and as you can see I still had some Bermuda Bay ink in the brush, so I'll try and take as much as possible out, so we're starting with a clean brush. I am going to apply some water to this piece of shimmery white card. Normally this would be clean water, but we'll just pretend it's clean water today. It's still got a little bit of Bermuda Bay ink in there. I'll just apply the water to the card. It's in a rough rectangular shape. This will help the ink run when I apply it to the card. So now I'm going to apply just a few drops of water to the ink refill and mix it up. I'll fill the brush with colour and I'm going to touch it down onto the card, and you'll see that the colour will spread easily into the wet background. This is great because you don't get a big dark part when you first apply the colour. Just keep adding the colour into that rectangle of water. This has come up as sort of a medium tone background. The card front that I created earlier is a much lighter shade. I didn't use quite so many drops of ink refill in this one, whereas this one I've just created, it's a little bit darker. So I'll keep this leftover refill and we'll use it in a minute, and I'll show you some of the other backgrounds that I did earlier. Now with the background that we've just created, you could dry this with a heat tool or set it aside to dry. I'm not going to use this one today because I don't want to take up too much time drying with a heat tool. So I have some previously done and dried backgrounds here. This is one you can see more strokes and lighter areas, and for the one we just did, those lines will form more as it starts to dry. But I really do like these lighter areas in this background. So with this one I had a lot more water laid down to start with, and it has dried and it's formed these sort of striations. This piece has lots of texture and it's a little too nice to cover her with flowers, so I'll just use that for something else later on. And then with this one down here, I've applied the colour direct to the paper. So I didn't lay down the layer of clean water first, and as you can see it's a much more solid image than when you lay the colour down first. So it's not quite as textured as this first piece we looked at. I think we'll use this particular piece with the lighter colours in it today, but while we're here I did see that some of the girls were using pigment sprinkles in their watercolour backgrounds in our challenge, so I thought I would try those as well. Bermuda Bay is one of the colours in the pigment sprinkles, and it does come out a very different colour though. It does have some true Bermuda Bay colour in it, but pigment sprinkles are made up of lots of different colours, and you can see that it's quite different. It's got a lot of green in it compared to the Bermuda Bay ink refill that I've used for those first backgrounds. So because I'm working to a colour challenge, I decided that I wouldn't use these green backgrounds, even though I really do like that colourway. I will stick with the background piece that I've created with the Bermuda Bay ink refill. So before we go any further, I wanted to add some splattering to this background piece just to give it a little bit more interest. So I'm going to grab that ink refill mix we used before, and I'll add another little drop of re-inker, and then I'll add more water to it and to make it more runny. We'll pick the ink up and get a nice brush full of colour. Be very careful that you move anything out of the road that is around. You will end up with splatter absolutely everywhere. Just be warned. You can see I've got bits of ink everywhere here already. So I've filled my brush up. It's very full of the refill mixture, and I'm going to tap down onto the piece, trying to get it in a bit of a diagonal movement here. So the closer that you get to your card, the bigger splatters. If you want very fine splatter, just move the brush further away. You can see this splatter is quite dark, but it looks great. I will clean my brush off so we don't have that same issue that I had before with there being blue ink. Sometimes the ink does go up into the barrel, so just make sure that that hasn't happened. And you can see now why I wanted to use a different brush for the orangey colours that I'm going to use. So that should dry before. I won't have to dry that with a heat tool, I don't think. See, it looks quite interesting. But if I set it aside, it should dry nicely before we have to stick the next elements onto it. So I have a sheet of fluid 100 watercolour paper here, which is what I'm going to use to create my flowers. I've used a full sheet, but you probably won't need it all, so you could cut this down a little bit if you wanted to. This is what I had left over from the card I made previously. So definitely cut this much off the end if you want to save your paper. I'm just going to use the whole lot today. I'll need a couple of blocks and my Grapefruit Grove and Calypso Coral ink refills. Now I'm just going to clean up my work area slightly so I don't end up with blue bits all over my orange flowers. And then let's set up our ink colours by putting a couple of drops of Grapefruit Grove on this block, and then the same in the Calypso Coral on the other block. Now they do look very similar once you've got them onto your blocks, so you need to be careful to remember which one is which. This time I'm going to use the large aqua painter, and I'll ensure that it is clean before I start to use it. It's pretty good. I am going to add some water to the piece of watercolour paper first, but this time instead of using my brush, because it's quite a large area, I'll use my spritzer just with plain water in it. I might grab a piece of paper towel first so I don't make a big mess on my desk. There we go. Now one side of the watercolour is smooth and one has a linen type look. You might be able to just see that there. I'll use the smooth side, although because we aren't stamping, it really doesn't matter. So just spritz the paper until you've got a light coating of water all over the piece. can see that's nicely covered, a little bit runny. And that's just going to help the ink move around a little bit as we apply it. Now I'll add the lighter colour first, that's the Grapefruit Grove. So we'll add a little bit of water to the re-inker and load up that brush and then apply the colour at the top of the piece of card and into the water, and you can see how well that runs. Now you want some dark and some light areas, so and it's not really going to matter because we're going to cut this up, so as long as you just ensure that you've got some texture, a couple of dark areas in it, it's going to be fine. Keep that extra refill because we will again be doing some splattering. Clean off your brush, not that it really matters because Calypso Coral is a darker colour. And we'll add some water to that. And it's the same process but down on the bottom part of the card. Just blend them in the middle. Again, the blending doesn't really matter too much because we are going to die cut from this piece. So I'm just trying to add a bit of texture. I've actually really sort of made it all one colour now, so I'll just grab that scrap piece of paper towel that I had before and just try and wick a little bit of colour up to add a couple of lighter areas around the place here. That's a little bit better. Now you could go ahead and dry that with a heat tool or set it aside to dry on its own. I'm going to set this piece aside because I do have a piece that I prepared a little earlier, which I hope is dry by now. And here is that piece that I prepared earlier and is now dry. We do need to add some splatter, so I'm going to add a couple more drops of ink refill to both the Calypso Coral and the Grapefruit Grove inks on the block. Now I have Calypso Coral already in my brush, so we'll start with the darker colour first. I've added a little bit more water to the mix, and again, after moving everything out of the road, I'm going to just tap onto that loaded brush till we get a little bit of darker splatter with the Calypso Coral ink over the Calypso Coral end. So I'll clean my brush off now because I do not want to get the Calypso Coral ink in the Grapefruit Grove. And again, add a little bit of water, mix that up and tap down over the Grapefruit Grove section. So again, you could set that aside to dry or dry it with a heat tool. I think if we set that aside to dry, it should be okay for us to start to punch out of. So what we've ended up now is two watercolour pieces. We've got the Calypso Coral and Grapefruit Grove piece and this Bermuda Bay piece that we created a little earlier. The orangey coloured piece seems to be dry or dry enough to punch out of. So I've got my small bloom punch here and I'm just going to punch out a random number of flowers. So some from the lighter end and some from the darker end. I actually can't remember how many I used on my card, but I used a lot, a lot of flowers. You probably need to use about half the sheet, so if you cut it in half and used half the sheet for punching and then the other half for die cutting those very cute little flowers from the Forever Lovely die set. So the In the Tropics dies also have a similar sized 5-petaled flower, which I think also would work quite well. Now once you've punched and die cut the flowers from both colours, what you end up with is a whole heap of flowers. Here are some that I prepared earlier. I've already glued some of the smaller die cut flowers from the punched flowers, onto the punched flowers, so that you didn't have to watch me doing that. We will do that with the two that I've already punched. Now, I don't know if you noticed on the card when I showed you before, but these flowers have a very fine shimmer over them. That's added with the clear Wink of Stella, and I did that before I started gluing them down. It's a little difficult to see here, but they actually look really stunning in real life. You can just see it. It's a little bit hard to see on the camera, but in the sunlight, it's just gorgeous. So just grab the Wink of Stella pen, and we'll quickly add a little bit of shimmer to these flowers. So it's nothing fancy, I'm just scribbling it over. And then really you should wait until the Wink of Stella is dry. But I'll go ahead and add some multi-purpose liquid glue now, and hopefully it's dry enough that the flower will stick when I put it on top. I'm going to grab a couple of the contrasting flowers. I'm using the larger flowers. They fit better onto the small bloomed punched flower. So in that die there's 2 large flowers and 2 smaller flowers. I'm just using the 2 larger ones, and then I'll use the smaller ones just on their own on the card. You could, oh, that one's not very straight, is it? Never mind. You could actually, layer the smaller flowers up on top of the large flowers like this and make a multi-leveled flower. But I haven't done that today. I've just used the 2. You could also add an embellishment into the centre of the flowers if you liked, maybe an adhesive rhinestone or of some sort. So I'll set my flowers aside for a minute while I work on the leaves. Now I've done some leaves with Pretty Peacock cardstock, so that's my Pretty Peacock colouring in this colour challenge. So I've used this leaf die from the Lovely Flower die set, and I've cut about 7, I think there's 7 there of those. I'll set those aside for a minute. And I think the last thing to do before we put the card together is to work on the greeting piece. So I'm going to emboss the greeting. I'm going to use the Stamparatus, and I have the Love You greeting already set up here on the plate, the greetings from the Forever Lovely stamp set. I will use my polypropylene sheet for this. Now it is photopolymer stamp, so I don't really need to use this to position it. However, I've got very addicted to using my poly sheet whenever I'm trying to position one of my stamps. So I'll just ink this quickly up with black Memento ink to stamp my index image. And then I will clean off the stamp because we are using Versamark to do our embossing. I've got my background piece here. We're going to stamp directly onto the background piece. And which end will we use? I quite like this end with the lighter bits, but I'm not quite sure whether that will work. This is the end I'm going to put the flowers on, so I think this might be better to put the flowers at this end here. If you're wondering why this is such a big decision, you can see that this is narrower and this end is wider. So if I put my swathe of flowers down here on this wider edge, it's going to make this end look even narrower. So if we flip it around and put the swathe of flowers down here, hopefully that will even it out a little bit. So let's now position that Love You where we would like it. So I can move this card around under here and know that I can get the Love You exactly where I want on my cardstock before I stamp it. I'll just better bring in my white embossing powder here. I'll also need my embossing buddy and a little spoon to dish the powder out with. So we'll get this to where I want it. And then I can lift up the flexible sheet and pop my magnet down to hold the whole piece in place. I'll give that a quick swipe with my embossing buddy, being very careful not to move that sheet. Did I ink it up? I don't think so. So we'll ink up the stamp with Versamark and then stamp it down into place. Now ensure you get good coverage because you'll only get one shot at this once you start to put the powder on. I can't see the image at all there, so I hope I've got that to come out okay. We'll soon see. Sprinkle the powder on, and that looks pretty good. So I'll tap off the excess. Yep, that's nice. I'll put the lid back on the powder and bring in the heat tool so I can set this powder. So I'm voicing this over so you won't hear the noise of the heat tool, but you can see that's starting to turn there now. And it does actually stand out a lot better than the one I did earlier. The one that I did earlier was, because the background was so light, I actually had to add some sponging over the top to help make the greetings stand out. Which worked okay, but this one I'm not going to need to do that because it's standing out quite well. So I'll just clean this off and then we're ready to put this card together. Clear a bit of space, get rid of all my embossing powder and bits and pieces. Bring in all of the elements. So I've got my flowers and the leaves. And the one thing that I will say is that I glued my flowers on with the liquid glue. You could use glue dots if you wanted to, but I am only applying glue in the center of the flower so that I've left the edges free because I am going to tuck the green leaves in after I've finished. So you'll just need a little bit of leeway under the petals to tuck those leaves in. So now I am going to apply all of these flowers and I'm going to try and space them out and use the various different shades so that you don't end up with all of the dark flowers at one end. I just put a little bit too much glue on that one, so taking some off. But yeah, you want some variation in the colour. So mix up the dark and light. I'm going to put this on fast forward because it does take a little while to apply all the flowers, so stick with me for a minute and we'll pop them all into place. You'll notice I'm popping the very last two flowers up with dimensionals. So this last one is with glue, but the two very last flowers, which is one in the center here and one down to the left-hand corner, are popped up with dimensionals just to give an extra added little bit of interest. And so now we can move on to the leaves. So I'm just going to pop the leaves in underneath, but you will probably need to snip off the ends, the stem ends of the flowers, just so they'll go underneath. I'll use my tweezers to pry those leaves up a little bit, because I'm going to add, once I've cut the end off here, I'll just add a little touch of glue. So I want those petals lifted up a little bit so I can slide the flower in underneath. So, oh, and that's probably way too much glue, but let's slide that in under. I'll just get rid of that excess. And then I will add the leaves in pairs. So the next leaf I'll pop quite close to that one. So I'll end up with 3 pairs and 1 single leaf around the outside of this flower bundle. So I'm going to pop you back on to fast forward again. So I'm just about finished the leaves. I'll just add the last one on over here. Actually, I think I've got my 3 pairs and 1 single leaf, so I won't need that last little leaf. I'm now going to go ahead and add some of the smaller flowers. So I've just put little dots of liquid glue and I'll drop those smaller flowers on. Same way that I do with my sequins. So again, I'll choose a variety of different shades. Where else? We're putting some down at the bottom, some at the top. It's just to extend that swathe of flowers. I'm liking that word swathe today, have you noticed? That's it. You can also use some of these smaller flowers to fill in any little gaps where you can see too much of the Bermuda Bay through the flowers. Use this colour. Hold it in place to make sure that it's well stuck down. Now you could also have used glue dots for these, and in hindsight I will probably say to you use the glue dots, because we did have a little bit of an issue with some of them not sticking very well, and I did have to go back through later on and use glue dots anyway. So I think that's about enough flowers. I'll have some leftovers to use on the inside of the card. And we are about ready to finish the card off. I have a scored piece of Whisper White cardstock here. I'll fold that, give it a bit of a crease with my bone folder. I've got 2 because remember I have that other background to mount up as well. And now I need to decide what colour mat. So I've got 1 Pretty Peacock mat here and 1 Grapefruit Grove mat. So I wasn't very indecisive, couldn't decide which one. So I think the darker background would benefit from the lighter Grapefruit Grove matte, and the lighter background will look quite nice on the pretty peacock. I think that's the way we'll go. So just adhere your layers with either multi-purpose liquid glue, or if you're using a tape, I would recommend the tear and tape. The watercolor paper needs a little bit more than just snail, I think, especially when we've got this quite substantial front layer with all these flowers on it. You do not want it falling off. Now I am going to jump ahead here because I'm pretty sure we all know how to glue layers together. So let's do a quick transition to the end of this process. So here we go, I'm up to gluing the last card we created with the Grapefruit Grove matte onto the folded white card front. As usual, I've got glue everywhere. And that goes nicely into place. And guess what? I think we've now completed both of these cards, and I am ready to decide which one is going to go up into the Colour Inspiration Colour Challenge number 72. So we've got, I'll move everything aside for a minute. So we've got both cards here. This is there's a lighter coloured background with the dark matte, and the darker background with the light matte. These flowers are slightly lighter in colour. I think every different watercolour piece you do is going to be a little bit different. These ones are a little bit darker, and there seems to be a lot more contrast in colour there. So pop on over to the blog and you'll see which one I chose to go up into the challenge. Thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you've made it through to the end of the video. I would love you to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and if you would like to watch me create live on Facebook, then the links to my Whimsy Wednesday Stampin' Up group are in the video description below. Bye.